afternoon, and welcome to the latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's series of conversations with authors about their books, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I'm Ron Graneri, the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America in the West, and all of us at FPRI welcome you to this conversation, and thank you for joining us live on Zoom and recorded on the FPRI YouTube page. The second half of the history of the Soviet Union, after Nikita Khrushchev's not-so-secret speech in 1956, was a time of paradoxes. Never quite as free as the West, but much freer than it had been under Stalin, Soviet society opened enough small cracks for some intellectuals and writers to experiment with new thoughts and new arguments. Critics of the regime, many of them, hoped to use the Soviet Union's own stated ideals to justify their critique. And this dissident movement grew in the 1960s and 1970s, then only to fade by the early 1980s, ironically, just as reformist ideas within the Soviet leadership began to flourish under Mikhail Gorbachev, the most paradoxical twist in a story rich in them. In his new book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, Benjamin Nathans offers a history of the dissident movement that both showcases the variety of voices within it and also identifies the through lines in the arguments of the dissidents. It's a story rich in personal drama and irony, a story that needs to be told and better understood, both here and there. There is much to learn, and as he concludes in his final sentences, should the Russians find their way to political pluralism and the rule of law, they too will need a usable past, and the history of the Soviet dissident movement will be waiting for them. And so we're delighted to have a chance to talk about that movement today. Who were the dissidents? What did they want to achieve? Did their goals match their desires? And what is their legacy? These are the questions, and yours, that we will engage in with our guest, Benjamin Nathans. Benjamin Nathans is the author and editor of 5 books, including not only To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, but also Beyond the Pale, The Jewish Encounter with Late Imperial Russia, which was awarded the Koret Jewish Hit Book Award and the Vucinich Book Prize and the Lincoln Book Prize, and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award in History. A frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books and the Times Literary Supplement, Professor Nathans is the Alan Charles Kors Professor, Associate Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses on Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, modern European Jewish history, and the history of human rights. And we are delighted to have him with us today. Welcome, Ben Nathans.
Thank you, Ron. Really great to be with you.
Yeah. So, Ben, I want to start. What made you decide to go from Beyond the Pale to this book? Like, how does this fit in when people ask about your academic trajectory? How did you get from there to here?
Yeah, the trajectory is bumpy and nonlinear in the sense that I was drawn to this topic through on two very different levels. One is after finishing Beyond the Pale, I just wanted new terrain to explore. There was a certain restlessness in me. I wanted a new century, a different cast of characters. But the other was that I was becoming more and more interested in the way people who live in non-democratic societies, authoritarian, totalitarian, the way they think about their political options, or I guess you should say the way they think about what room for maneuver there is for political engagement in systems like that. And I started reading memoirs by people who lived through the second half of Soviet history, the post-Stalinist half. And the most immediately accessible memoirs were those by dissidents. Some of them you will have heard of, and your listeners will have heard of: Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Andrei Sakharov, but also many, many others who I certainly had never heard of, but who I thought were part of the same story of political engagement under extremely challenging circumstances. And those two things, the restlessness and the curiosity, got me really into the topic.
Right. And, it is a massive material, right? We should warn readers, who of course should all rush out and get their copy of the book, that when they get it, they should lift with their legs, because it is a 600 plus page narrative of this. And I guess one of the things that fascinated me to get started was when one thinks of dissidents, one immediately thinks of writers, fiction writers, and sort of writers of political manifestos. And you point out two things that I think are really fun and interesting, if we could say Russian history is fun and interesting, because of course it's fun and interesting, is one is that for Russians to call somebody a writer, that's more than just somebody who happens to put words down on a page. And so a lot of these people didn't think of themselves as writers per se. But then also the people that you talk about at the beginning, at least several of them, are not in the humanities at all, right?
That's right.
The first hero of your story is a mathematician.
Yes.
So yeah, tell me about how what this discovery was like for you.
Yeah, numerically, there's no question that people from what we now call the STEM fields really constituted the majority of the dissident movement. There were humanists from all different kinds of fields, writers, people in higher education, critics, editors, but scientists, and mathematicians, and engineers are strikingly present in this movement, and they bring a certain way of thinking, a certain rigor, but also a certain amateurism to the analysis of social problems. This is not their professional bread and butter. They have very strong moral instincts about free speech and free assembly. And for some of them, their experience as members of the scientific community, and that's a global community by the post-war period, also informs the way they approach social and political problems. So one of the fascinations of this story for me is that there's just a high concentration of extremely well-educated, thoughtful people, deep thinkers, who are, as we would call them, politically engaged intellectuals. And that for me is a kind of permanently interesting character type. The man or woman, and there are many women in the movement, the person of ideas who's not satisfied just operating in the world of ideas, but also wants to actually make a difference in the way the practical arrangements of a place like the Soviet Union might change in the short and the long term. And for me, the human drama is really, in a way, the center of the story, is watching those kinds of people try to engage in politically meaningful behavior in very challenging circumstances.
I mean, it's almost, does it require a degree of both a degree of amateurism or naivete almost, but also an engineer's or a mathematician's faith in logic to be willing to make arguments challenging the Soviet leadership in say the 1960s?
I think it does. I think there's a certain confidence that comes with the scientific worldview, especially if you're, say, a physicist circa 1965.
Right.
I mean, when you think about the terrain that physics had conquered in the 20th century, who wouldn't feel a sense of triumph and confidence about your ability to solve problems and to come up with solutions for complex problems? You know, the flip side of amateurism, which is usually a put down, the flip side of that is that, and it's one of the things that I love about the Russian intellectual tradition, is that there's a certain fearlessness in going outside your own discipline. And Sakharov is a perfect example of that. Here we have, a world-class theoretical physicist who also was the architect of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, someone who could not only come up with theoretical arguments on paper, but was extremely gifted at translating them into an actual device that would work in the world. His entry into the dissident movement was essentially triggered by his concerns with the biological effects of testing nuclear weapons. And he objected to the policies of the Kremlin, and not only the Kremlin, when it came to permitting above-ground testing of nuclear weapons, even though he knew almost nothing about what happens when radioactive particles enter human tissue. But he didn't care. He felt as qualified as anyone to talk about the consequences of nuclear testing, even if they weren't part of his training as a physicist. And this is something that we find over and over again. Mathematicians who take an interest in Soviet law and think that they have something meaningful to say about legal language and legal doctrine. You don't find that in the United States so much. Everyone's sort of more or less in their lane.
Right. Well, and yeah, I was thinking that the professional and professional disciplinary development, right? Keeps people feeling like I shouldn't talk about the things that I'm not an expert in because I don't want to appear to be less than an expert. But at the
Yes.
same time, right, that it is fascinating, as you point out, right? People who feel like, well, if I figured out how to harness the power of the atom, I think I can talk about the better way to manage testing of weapons or deal with
Definitions of modern science is it's organized skepticism. Why shouldn't that quality be applied to political questions and the behavior of states?
Yeah. I see. And so to come back to bring the humanities in briefly, but I want to pick up on that scientific thing as well. But the beginning of the book, you talk about the basic problem of terminology and language and the question of, what are we supposed to call these people, right? Why do we call them dissidents? And even though, like, the more you know, the more inadequate that term is.
Yeah.
So what's the problem with the word dissident?
So the term dissident, as you said, doesn't fully do justice to the phenomenon that it's trying to describe. But as I discovered, it's also inescapable. You can't not use it.
Uh-huh.
The people who first started using the term as applied to the Soviet engaged intellectuals that the book tries to chronicle were Western journalists.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, I think, extremely telling that Western journalists posted in Moscow who were covering Soviet developments in real time, and who, in a sense, were the gatekeepers about what information about the Soviet Union reached readers in the West. They had an extraordinary influence on how we look at things, down to the level of how we name things. The Soviet government was happy to adopt the term dissident to describe these people because it was a Western term. And so it reinforced the Kremlin's argument that dissidents, at the end of the day, were really just puppets of the CIA, the MI6, and other Western intelligence services. It was a way of branding them with a foreign-sounding name. So Russians use the term dissident, but everybody understands immediately that it's a Western word that's been imported into Russian. The problem is when you get to the actual meaning of the word. And dissident comes from Latin, meaning someone who sits apart. And that in itself is sort of the beginning of the confusion, because dissidents did not sit apart. They were not some tiny sect attempting to break away from Soviet society. They were some of the most publicly engaged individuals that country has ever seen. And what I discovered in my research is that the dissidents themselves did not like being called a dissident. Mm-hmm. For example, when a Western observer made the mistake of referring at a meeting with dissidents, of referring to Andrei Sakharov as a dissident, his wife, Yelena Bonner, piped up and said, "My husband is not a dissident. My husband is a physicist." Very telling remark. They really did not want to be known as dissidents. They wanted to be known for their professional identities, and in Sakharov's case, for his really world-class professional achievements, and as someone who was a physicist who was engaged in issues of public concern.
Right.
But I found no other vocabulary to describe them because the literature is just saturated with that term, dissident and dissident movement, and they themselves adopted it in the absence of anything better.
Interesting. I mean, it is one of the challenges because it's a Western term as well, right? That the image of the dissident in Western media and Western consciousness is someone who is a harsh critic of the Soviet regime and sort of is working for its overthrow, let's say, or working to undermine it. When
Yes.
That's not necessarily true what many of these folks, certainly not what many of these folks thought they were trying to do. And even explicitly, right? They were saying, no, we want the Soviet state to live up to the words in the Soviet Constitution.
Yes, it took many, many repeatings of their agenda for it to begin to get through to Western observers that they were not revolutionaries. They'd had it up to here with revolution, right, and the consequences of revolution for millions, tens of millions of people. They were extremely measured. They were fans of a kind of self-limiting approach to political change, which embraced the categories and the aspirations of the Soviet system itself, at least the legal dimension of that system. So as powerful as the Western gaze was, as powerful as the Western ability to name the phenomenon itself, to give it the name that we all use, that I use in the book, dissidents themselves had their own profile, which they labored mightily to make clear to their fellow citizens, to their political leaders, and not least to an increasingly fascinated Western public.
Right. And what role did Western institutions play? Right. We talk about that Western journalists help to label and, let's say, make famous dissidents. But there's a big section in your book where you talk about the role of, say, Amnesty International, and which has a very sort of ambivalent relationship to both the dissidents on one side and the Soviet state on the other.
Yeah.
And so what role did organizations like Amnesty play in shaping the movement?
Let me take your question in its broadest dimensions about what role Western institutions writ large, and then I'll get to Amnesty shortly. So you can't tell the story without the West as a major factor. And you know as well as anyone else that the dissident story played out within the framework of the Cold War. This was a political and ideological force field that for 4 decades, basically no one could escape. Certainly no one who lived in the United States or the Soviet Union. Right. So the Cold War looms massively in the background. That magnetic field is always present. The other thing I need to mention is that the communication network whereby Soviet dissidents were able to reach their fellow Soviet citizens, despite the constant monitoring and persecution by the KGB, involved Western shortwave radio stations. These radio stations, in many cases, and you know their names, the Voice of America, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, the BBC, the Deutsche Welle, many of these radio stations were relics of the Second World War. Mm-hmm. They had been invented during that war to enable the Allied powers, especially the United States and Britain, to reach the home audience in Germany and fascist Italy, to essentially go over the heads of Hitler's mass media and reach Germans directly via shortwave radio. They repurposed themselves after the Second World War for the new agenda of the Cold War. And many of the texts that dissidents produced and disseminated among themselves by retyping them on very thin onion skin paper, many of those texts were smuggled to the West, some by Western journalists, some by Western diplomats, some by tourists. There may be people in your audience who smuggled samizdat in the 1970s or early 80s. Many of them made their way to the headquarters of these Western shortwave radio broadcast services.
Right.
And were then read aloud as what we would now call audiobooks to a Russian-speaking or a Ukrainian-speaking audience back home. So without that communication network involving Western radio broadcasters, this story would have been entirely different.
Right.
You mentioned, sorry.
I just want to jump in. One of the many paradoxes here is that Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe also, for much of their early history, were indeed fully funded by the CIA. So the Soviet government is not wrong to say the CIA played a role in transmitting these ideas.
Absolutely.
It's different from the dissidents themselves aren't working for the CIA, but Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe is.
Yes. And of course, what Radio Liberty and what the Voice of America chose to broadcast among the, tsunami of samizdat texts that were making their way west is very significant. They highlighted some things and they left other things in silence. Yeah. You also asked about Amnesty International, which is just the most prominent example of a series of Western human rights non-governmental organizations or NGOs. And 2 chapters of the book are devoted to the just incredibly interesting relationship between these NGOs and the dissidents, who are sort of feeling each other out, trying to speak in the other's language, but not really fluent in it, and hoping for some kind of either alliance or patron-client relationship. Amnesty is very keen to, and this is their language, to adopt Soviet prisoners of conscience, many of whom are the subjects of my book, these dissidents, to adopt them and to plead their cause, to publicize their cause. And of course, the dissidents are immensely grateful for this. But they don't just want to be adoptees of a Western NGO. They themselves look to Amnesty as a potential model for the kinds of organizations that they themselves aspire to found, even though the idea of a non-governmental organization in a communist country, to put it mildly, is extremely problematic. Because if there's one thing we know that communist parties did, it was to exercise a monopoly on all organized political behavior. So a non-governmental organization in a communist country is kind of an oxymoron. But the Soviet dissidents were really inspired by Amnesty, because when they looked at Amnesty International and the International League for the Rights of Man, with headquarters in Strasbourg and New York, and other NGOs advocating for human rights, they thought, here are organizations that are above the Cold War fray, which is exactly what the dissidents wanted to position themselves. Not anti-communist, not anti-Soviet, not aspiring to topple the Soviet government, but the much more minimalist, but still highly consequential goal of making the Soviet government live up to its own laws, including the civil liberties enshrined in the Soviet Constitution. And so for them, Amnesty was like a beacon on a hill. This is how we should be organizing our work. And that Amnesty, of course, was very uncomfortable with their adoptees becoming partners. That they hadn't seen that coming. And there was a whole, there was practically a civil war inside Amnesty's London headquarters about how to react to this new agenda on the part of Soviet dissidents.
I mean, in a way, one gets the impression that because Amnesty wanted to be above the Cold War, they felt like, well, we can't work with folks who are somehow being criticized by the Soviet government. Like, we're okay with critics of the government, but if the government doesn't like them, then that automatically makes us, say, tools of Cold War propaganda, and we can't have that.
Yes. So one of the fascinating things about Amnesty, and I worked in their archives in Amsterdam. It's one of the best archives I've worked in. Amnesty went through incredible gymnastics to preserve both the appearance and the reality of being impartial. And one of the ironclad rules in Amnesty, it's still true today, is that activists cannot work on behalf of prisoners of conscience in their own country, because that creates a conflict of interest. So you're only allowed to work on behalf of activists in other countries. And furthermore, during the Cold War, this is no longer the case today, but during the Cold War, you had to adopt as close as possible to an equal number of prisoners of conscience in the capitalist world, the socialist world, and the third world, the socialist world being the second world.
Sure.
And this sense of ideological balance was, I think, really an obsession with Amnesty. And once you allowed Soviet dissidents into the organization, not as adoptees, but as partners, that sense of balance was extremely fragile, because they, of course, were active with respect to their own government.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting thing, right? The idea that basically, if you worked in an Amnesty office, like, you literally were counting the number of people you were writing letters on behalf of, and saying, "Oh, we need a couple more from the West," right? Has Franco arrested anybody recently that we can make sure we include in the list?
Yes. Right? Although, the British were arresting members of the IRA. IRA was not a non-violent organization, but they were also arresting people who were protesting nuclear weapons. So there were people who qualified as prisoners of conscience in the West.
Sure.
The real asymmetry in Amnesty, which they never really overcame, was that the overwhelming majority, and I mean 98% of Amnesty members, activists, were not only from the West, they were from NATO countries.
Yeah.
And they never figured out a way to balance the membership roles in the second and third worlds.
That's an interesting point. I mean, I guess that's a story for itself. I guess we could figure that
It
out.
is.
But it does highlight this other problem that during the period of détente in the late 60s and into the 70s, precisely when there was a thawing of relations between East and West, so the Cold War was starting to go away, one gets the feeling that Western governments become increasingly uncomfortable with the dissident movement because they don't know, is it possible? And I know this from my work on the Germans, and you're aware of this too, right? Is that there's almost a sense of, if we make too big a deal out of these dissidents, is that going to spoil our relation, the governmental negotiations that are essential for reducing nuclear weapons?
Yes.
And this of course leads to, in the United States, it leads to the famous moment when President Ford declines to meet with Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the White House.
Yes. Yep. I mean, you've put your finger on an issue which is as alive today as it was 40 or 50 years ago. What is the best way to promote human rights in China? Is it naming and shaming? Is it making a public fuss? Or is it behind the scenes?
Yeah.
And can you do both at the same time, or are they mutually undermining? All of these questions were as burning in the 1970s vis-a-vis Moscow as they are today vis-a-vis China or Iran or North Korea. And unfortunately, the list of countries is quite long.
And it's an unanswerable problem, right? Because I can't tell you for sure which one works better.
Yeah, but history, as always, is a good guide. And it may be the only guide, in fact, that we have to this. And one thing that I learned in the course of doing my research by looking at the transcripts of Politburo discussions is that Soviet leaders, all the way up to the top of the system, Leonid Brezhnev, Soviet leaders were extremely sensitive to what the West said about the Soviet Union's human rights record. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is, as strange as it may sound, the Soviets really believed that they had a superior approach to human rights. They had a Marxist approach to human rights, which was not to abstract things like free speech and free assembly, but to make them part of a system of entitlements. So it's all fine to say there's freedom of the press. The Soviet question was always, well, there's freedom of the press if you own the press. But if you don't own a press, then it's just a mirage. So they really prided themselves on having the most advanced system of human rights protection, at least on paper. But the degree of sensitivity was even beyond what I expected. And it came home to me one day when I was sitting in an archive reading a transcript of remarks by Brezhnev to the Central Committee of the Communist Party. This is in roughly 1976, so it's the immediate aftermath of the Helsinki Accords, the latest international agreement about human rights norms. Picture this. Leonid Brezhnev is talking to the Central Committee, and he is complaining about coverage of the Soviet Union's human rights record in the Baltimore Sun. Now, I'm from Baltimore. Okay, that's my hometown. Right. I grew up reading the Sun, very proud of that newspaper. But the idea of the leader of a superpower complaining about coverage in, let's face it, a provincial newspaper is mind-blowing. I don't think an American president could name a provincial Russian newspaper. Couldn't do it then, probably couldn't do it now. And this, for me, a light bulb went off. And I'm like, oh my God, Leonid Brezhnev cares what the Baltimore Sun says about human rights in the Soviet Union. Bing. Now, not all leaders care that much. And there's a very interesting debate going on now among Russia experts about, does Putin care about his media coverage in the West? It's not nearly as clear as it was in the late Soviet period.
Right. I mean, that reminds me of what was when we taught the Cold War course together, early in the century. And you told the story, Brezhnev's a funny guy, right? Because, he sees himself as somebody who is saving the Soviet Union or bringing the Soviet Union to global recognition. Yeah. But is also somebody who is deeply connected to Western ideas and collects Western things, right? So the joke with the punchline when his mother says, "But son, what are we going to do when the communists come back?" when he shows her the automobiles he gets from the West.
Right.
But that Brezhnev does care about this, and it is, I will say, it is one of the fun parts of the book, is there these discussions. But also what I found fascinating was when they have this discussion about specific dissidents and the question of, well, what are we going to do with person X?
Yes.
Right. And it seems like there were always like three options, right? It was, well, there were four. Ignore was one option, but they weren't going to pick ignore. But the other options were, well, we could throw him in jail, we could kill him, or we could expel him. And the expulsion one is the one that fascinates me, because I always wonder about this. When I was a kid, and because I was a weird kid and followed these things, and I found out that Alexander Solzhenitsyn had been essentially expelled from the Soviet Union. That seems like such an odd thing to do, because that means now he's free to say whatever the heck he wants, and isn't that a problem?
Right.
But that's like not how they see it.
You expel a kid from school so he can play all day.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So the number of people who were actually expelled, or who were allowed to leave and then had their citizenship revoked, which amounts to the same thing, was pretty low. I dare say it was fewer than a dozen. Many people were exiled inside the Soviet Union because it's such a huge country that remained part of the repertoire of punishment in the system long after, the British Empire stopped expelling people, banishing them to Australia or to Georgia. The Soviet Union kept up that practice well into the later 20th century. So the logic was, if you put this guy on trial, this guy, let's say Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he's going to make a stink. And by the time Solzhenitsyn was expelled, the Soviet leaders had learned their lessons many, many times over, that you could put a dissident on trial, you could make absolutely sure that they were convicted and sentenced to whatever you wanted them to be sentenced to, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 15 years. But you were not going to get the political dividends from that trial that you wanted, because the PR was going to be so nasty against the regime. So they didn't want to put Solzhenitsyn on trial because they knew that it would blow up in their faces. But they didn't want to simply imprison him without a trial, because then it might make them look weak. And what fascinated me about the transcripts of these Politburo discussions is how utterly instrumental they are. Nobody is citing any laws, any rules. It's just, how can we do this in a way that will be to the greatest advantage of us, of the leadership? And one of the paradoxes of an authoritarian system, and again, it applies to authoritarian countries today, is that in an authoritarian system, if the government allows someone to air criticism of this or that policy and doesn't punish that person, the message that gets communicated to the populace is it's okay to do that. There's no possibility in an authoritarian system for a citizen to conclude government doesn't care about this issue, or government is neutral about this issue, or government doesn't like what this guy's saying, but it doesn't consider it to be within its purview to punish him. In an authoritarian system, whatever is permitted appears to have the endorsement of the state. And so, of course, they can't let Solzhenitsyn continue to speak and write. They have to do something. They're in a sense prisoners of their own system. They can't be neutral.
Right. And I guess the hope is if he's expelled, or if somebody is not allowed to come back, well, you can try to keep their thoughts from getting back into the country as you're keeping them from getting back into the country.
It's interesting. Obviously, Solzhenitsyn did not lose the ability to communicate with ordinary Soviet citizens once he had established his residency in Vermont. He could still use the shortwave radio systems. What really changed is that Westerners were no longer as interested in him once he was in the West. His cachet among Western journalists plummeted once he was out, because there was no longer the drama of the persecuted writer story, which is, that's the gift that keeps on giving. So in that sense, they weren't wrong. Just like the Chinese government today is absolutely correct when it calculates that if it expels certain dissidents, the attention to them once they're gone, will plummet. That we know that because it's happened to many, many different people.
Right. Well, and this gets to a question that Ben Prubitok asks in the Q&A place, where I'm glad that even though I didn't tell people they should use the Q&A function, people remembered to use it. So thank you, listeners, watchers of Geopolitics with Granary, for being such quick studies. But he asked the question about the extent to which the dissidents understood or valued concepts like pluralism within the Soviet Union, and also when they get into the West, right? Because one of the things we were talking about before we got started is one of the things that makes Solzhenitsyn less appealing to Westerners after he moves to the United States is people realize that Alexander Solzhenitsyn is not a liberal, is not a Democrat. Yes, he is a free thinker. Yes, he is a challenger, but his values are not easily pigeonholed. And so as a result, people don't know what to do with him. But for dissidents in general, right, how did they see their relationship to, say, Western notions of liberalism, of pluralism, right? Did they see themselves fighting for those ideas, or did they have a particular Russian or Soviet vision of those, of what they were doing?
It's a fantastic question. And one of the things that I learned is that dissidents in the movement were astounded and kind of gobsmacked at the diversity of opinion among them. There were social democrats, I should say socialist democrats or democratic socialists in the movement. There were people who thought the market was the most important way to structure a society. There were people who didn't care about economics at all. There were deeply religious people. There were atheists. They found this common denominator called the rule of law, called civil rights and eventually human rights. And for many years, that glue was enough to hold them together. And yes, they celebrated pluralism, and they truly found it a remarkable thing that people who came from such different ideological standpoints could work together, because Soviet orthodoxy taught them that no such thing was possible, and not only not possible, not desirable. Right. That there needed to be ideological uniformity for any movement to be effective. And in memoir after memoir and diary after diary and personal letters, you just hear people saying, isn't it just a remarkable thing that we're so different politically, and yet we can work together on these issues of shared concern? Well, after a certain point, the movement had to confront its own political diversity. It was fine up until, let me rephrase that, so long as the movement's main agenda was to prevent a return to Stalinism, you could leave on the back burner all of the political differences. But once it became clear that Leonid Brezhnev was not going to be Joseph Stalin, and that even though there was a conservative backlash after the thaw under Khrushchev is removed from power in 1964, it's clear that the conservative backlash under Brezhnev is nothing compared to what happened under Stalin. People are not being rounded up and executed in the hundreds of thousands or sent to the gulag in the millions or tens of millions. So the anti-Stalinist platform kind of lost steam after a while, because it just wasn't what Brezhnev was trying to do. And once that disappeared, the dissident movement had to confront the political diversity within its own ranks. And that's where things started to get complicated, because it just wasn't as easy anymore to say, we're all for rule of law. What more than that do we need? And Solzhenitsyn, before his expulsion, and Andrei Sakharov, who never was expelled because he knew too much about the nuclear weapons program, they were among the first to say, we need a political platform. We need to go beyond just defending the civil liberties that are enshrined in the Soviet Constitution. We need to offer solutions to the dilemmas of Soviet society. And once that became the agenda, all the political differences came out. And the liberals didn't want to work with the Marxists. And the religious national patriots like Solzhenitsyn didn't want to work with the liberals. The liberals said, we celebrate pluralism. Solzhenitsyn said, pluralism is for people who have muddled heads. So things changed to a very great degree over the course of the movement. The movement's history lasts about 20 years. And by the midway point, people aren't celebrating diversities quite as much as they had in the beginning.
Interesting. Well, and this raises a question that Christopher Colvin asks. That's your book is about Soviet dissidents, but there was dissidents was a phenomenon throughout the Eastern Bloc, throughout the Second World. And while I'm not going to ask you to talk about stuff you didn't write your book about, I'm going to ask you about something you didn't write your book about, and that is what was the relationship between the dissident movement, such as it was within the Soviet Union, and the dissident movement within the Soviet bloc states? Was there fruitful collaboration, or was it salve qui peut?
Sure. No, that's a totally fair question. And I was interested when I worked on the book about, were there structural factors in Soviet style systems, not just the prototype, the Soviet Union itself, but the Soviet style regimes that were set up in Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and for that matter, in communist China. So I am interested. And in the epilogue to the book, I do some comparisons between those various systems. And here, in a nutshell, is what I found. Structurally, there is a very high degree of resemblance between the dissident movements across the Soviet bloc countries. That is, they're very law-centered. They're very focused on a very seemingly simple but not easy strategy of getting their respective governments to live up to their own laws. And sooner or later, they all realize that their most receptive audience is going to be in the West. Those are the similarities. The differences are that the dissident movements in the East Bloc countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, found much greater resonance in their own populations. And the main reason was that they all shared a kind of anti-Russian or anti-Soviet sentiment. They could all plausibly brand their local governments as puppets of Moscow, rather than really expressing the will of their own national groups. The other difference, and this is especially the case with China, is that whereas we were talking before about the remarkably high proportion of people from STEM fields in the Soviet dissident movement, mathematicians, scientists, engineers, those people are present among the Chinese dissidents too, but there are a lot of lawyers among the Chinese dissident movement, and those people actually understand law and legal systems. They are not jailhouse lawyers like the Soviet dissidents were. And that's a really striking quality of the Chinese dissident movement, is the really central role of lawyers. And to make it even more interesting, a very high, and of course I'm getting this from scholars in the field, I can't do my own research on China, a very high proportion of Chinese dissident lawyers are Christians. And their Christian beliefs are inseparable from their turn to the law as the most reliable and nonviolent way of achieving change.
Is it also, and I wonder, this I think about with dissidents, what sort of jobs do dissidents try to get, right? You talk about this a little bit in the book, right? We have the one image of the dissident intellectual who can't get an academic job and who works as a stoker in a boiler room someplace, but uses the time in between shoveling coal to read Hegel or write philosophical manifestos.
Yes.
But there's also the idea that there are some jobs that you're allowed to get to use your mind for that in and of themselves provide you with a little bit of protection. Like you can make a living as a lawyer. You can make a living as a math teacher and do your dissident stuff on the side.
Preferably, the further from politics, the better. So in that sense, physics, math, and engineering were ideal because by the 1960s and 70s, the Soviet government had essentially conceded that those fields didn't need to be utterly controlled by the party. Under Stalin, they were controlled by the party with some pretty dire consequences. So the further away from history and political science and sociology, the more protected you were, and the likelier it was that you could sort of carve out a professional niche for yourself, especially if you were very accomplished and had essentially made visible your value to the regime. That gave you some protection, as did coverage by the Western media. The more famous you were, in many cases, the more protection you had against extrajudicial punishment.
Interesting. So we have about 15 minutes to go, and there are
Yeah.
so many questions I want to ask. But I'm going to use the host privilege, and I'm going to ask a question in my own interest as a historian who's worked in archives.
Yeah.
How did you find your primary materials? And how many pieces of onion skin paper did you have to strain your eyes to try to read in order to write this book?
Yeah. So the source base for this book is extremely varied.
Mm.
There are an astonishing number of autobiographies by former Soviet dissidents. I keep a running count. I actually have a database, and there are now over 150 book-length autobiographies by dissidents. And, you know, this was not a large movement. I mean, the number of really active dissidents, people who signed their names to open letters and petitions, was probably never more than about 1,000.
Mm.
And this in a country of some 250 or so million people. Many, many more people than that read dissident text, and tens of millions listened to dissident text on these shortwave radio broadcasts. But the number of really sort of, you know, inner core activists was not that big. And 150 out of 1,000, that's 15% produced.
That's a lot.
Autobiographies. I don't think there's been another social movement in the 20th century where a higher proportion of activists produced their life stories in print. So that was a very important source. But as you know, Ron, memoirs are a tricky source to use because they're sort of, they're ready to wear. They give you their own interpretation of the protagonist's life. And as an historian, you can't just adopt someone else's sense making of their own life. You have to come up with your own. And so for that, the archives were critical. And for me, one of the most valuable archives was a non-state archive in Moscow. I hate to speak of it in the past tense, but this is the archive of the Memorial Society, which was set up by former dissidents under Gorbachev in an attempt to preserve and institutionalize the dissident legacy. And they gathered the papers, the diaries, the letters, everything you can imagine from dozens and dozens of dissidents. And this was a new thing to have a major archive not owned by the Russian state. And of course, the sad part of this story is that in the buildup to the full-scale war against Ukraine, which began in February of 2022, the Putin regime systematically dismantled Memorial and other non-governmental organizations, the Andrei Sakharov Center, the Helsinki Watch Groups, systematically dismantled these organizations before shutting them down and liquidating them, and in some cases, arresting or forcing their leaders into exile. So the Memorial Archive was foundational for my work. I couldn't have done this book without it. And then finally, the KGB itself. Now, I never did get permission to work in the KGB archive in Moscow, but one of the unintended benefits of the breakup of the Soviet Union for us historians is that every Republican branch of the KGB became its own independent archive. And I can tell you, the Lithuanians are very happy to welcome people like me into the archive of the Lithuanian branch of the KGB in Vilnius and roll out the red carpet and say, you can have the run of the place.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as good as the mother lode, which is Moscow, but you know, as with any highly centralized organization, there was a lot of communication between Moscow and Vilnius, Moscow and Kiev, Moscow and Yerevan, all of the provincial capitals. So Western researchers have access to the non-Russian former Soviet republics, including their KGB offices, and there is fantastic stuff there.
I hadn't thought about that, right? That there would obviously have been a KGB head office in Vilnius, and it's not like they picked up the archive and took it back to Moscow with them in 1990, right? Or they tried to, right?
Literally, I came across some files where someone had gone through with a razor blade and quickly cut out some particularly incriminating material, but they were in such a hurry to get out that they didn't even touch 95% of it. So it was like being a kid in the candy store.
Wow. So that's exciting, and you know, like I say, well, I'm glad I asked that question, because that's you know, for the people out there, right, for a historian, right, that's about as exciting as it gets, right?
It is.
Yeah,
it is.
So, well, since we brought up the issue of Putin and Memorial, Greg Bloomquist asks two related questions, and one of them is, So how did, what is the legacy, or how has dissidents changed under Putin? And he also asks the semi-sarcastic questions, right? Why didn't Putin expel Navalny? And I guess that's where we get into this idea is in what ways is we're jumping over. We can also talk about the relationship of the dissident movement to Gorbachev's reforms. But when we think about Russia today, what is the relationship between the state and anything that could be approaching a dissident movement, and what have they learned, or what have they tried to learn from what's going on, what happened during this dissident period from the 60s to the 80s?
Sure. Let me deal with the second question first, and I'm not sure it was sarcastic. I'm going to take it at face value.
It's a legitimate question. It is.
Yeah. Why didn't Putin simply expel Navalny? So Putin, who himself is a product of the Soviet system and was formed within the organization whose mission was to crush the dissident movement, which it eventually more or less did, the KGB, in other words. Putin is not a dummy, and he has drawn many, many lessons from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one of them is that his PR and his way of dealing with dissent is much more sophisticated in some ways than the Soviet method. And he recognized that expelling people was terrible PR for the system that did the expulsion. It gave the world the impression that they didn't know how to deal with these people and that they simply couldn't cope with them. So, to my knowledge, Putin has not expelled anybody from the Soviet Union. What he has done is make people offers that they can't refuse. So, sure, you can stay, but you'll be in prison for the next 10 years. So you might want to look into getting a visa to go abroad. And Putin, in the immediate aftermath of the full-scale assault on Ukraine, permitted nearly 1 million people, including quite a few draft-aged males, to simply leave the Russian Federation. Very different strategy from the Soviet Union. So Putin's regime recognizes that it can simply create a kind of safety valve and let the troublemakers leave if they want, where they will not cause nearly as much trouble as they might if they stayed in the Soviet Union. They certainly won't create bad PR for the regime. Now, Navalny is obviously a special case. He's not just a troublemaker. He's the most credible opponent and alternative to Putin in the Russian political landscape. Now, we know that Navalny was poisoned at least twice. What we don't know is whether those poisonings were meant to kill him or simply to scare him so badly that he would either cease and desist from his opposition activity or would leave the country. And he did leave the country after the second poisoning. As you know, he went to Germany, where he was saved and revived, resuscitated, and he chose to go back. Now, you could argue that Putin could have blocked his return, but that would not have looked good because Navalny was a Russian citizen. So, Putin would have had to have done something very heavy-handed, and that would have garnered enormous media attention. So I won't say he had to let Navalny back in, but that was the least bad option, I think, that Putin faced at that point. So he let him back in and immediately imprisoned him and eventually arranged for his death in prison, which, by the way, the Soviet regime did very, very rarely. Very few dissidents were killed by the KGB. They were poisoned, for sure. They were threatened. They were blackmailed. Their family members were threatened. The whole range of extrajudicial punishments, but very rarely murder. Very, very rarely. The other question about sort of the legacy of dissent today, I originally planned a very different conclusion to the book. I was going to trace the sort of ups and downs of the afterlife of the dissident movement in the post-Soviet period. The subtitle of the book is The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. And it's kind of a play on words. The dissident movement almost died a couple times. It was almost crushed, but it always managed to resurrect itself and reinvent itself in new forms until it didn't. Until the early 1980s, when it really was finally crushed.
Right.
But the other meaning is all of the dissidents who we've never heard of, the people operating below the level of visibility of people like Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov and Sharansky and others. I wanted to tell their stories too. In fact, I argue that they are the ones who actually built the movement. They are the backbone of the movement, not the famous ones that American journalists brought to world attention.
Right.
But the original conclusion was going to be about the afterlife, the other many lives of the movement after the Soviet Union itself disappeared. And it's very interesting to trace the kind of reputational roller coaster ride that the movement experienced. But then, you know, the annexation of Crimea came along, and then the full-scale assault on Ukraine in total, and the ups and downs became kind of moot because it was all down all the time.
Right.
And there has now been just an enormous crushing of any kind of dissent. You can't even call the war a war, or at least for a long time you couldn't. You had to call it a special military operation because that's what Putin called it. So there really is no organized dissent. Many of the people who would have been dissidents have left the country because they feared for their safety and the safety of their family members. They're trying to organize in exile, but that's a very difficult thing to do. So the picture is very grim inside Russia today. Very, very grim.
I mean, if you get to the point where you can't hold up a sign, you can't hold up a blank piece of paper, you can't hold up your hands as if you were holding up a blank piece of paper, it does make it hard.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more to talk about. I have one final question, which I should have asked earlier, but I'm going to ask right now, and that is, you know, that the dissident movement, as you describe it, fades in the early 1980s. In part, the KGB succeeds in crushing it, but then comes Gorbachev, and so how should we, and how do people who study Russian history understand the relationship? You know, was there any influence of the dissident movement in what came later, or is it are these parallel tracks, that there's a movement for reform within the party that culminates in Gorbachev, and there's a movement for reform outside the party, the dissidents? The dissident train ends, but the Gorbachev train keeps going.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can answer it in several different parts, but I can't answer it in any comprehensive way.
Fair.
Here's what Gorbachev himself said. Let's begin with the man himself and his own testimony. We know from his memoirs that he did read some samizdat texts, mostly because his wife got her hands on them, and then Gorbachev read them too.
Yes.
We also know that Gorbachev's vocabulary, especially his vocabulary of reform, bears a striking resemblance to some of the key words of the dissident movement. So when we think of Gorbachev, you know, if you have enough miles on your odometer, you remember the word glasnost from the second half of the 1980s. It's a Russian word that means openness or transparency. That was one of the key words of the dissident strategy, was, you know, open trials. Let's have everybody be under scrutiny in terms of how the law is carried out. Gorbachev's slogan of democratization. The dissident movement was also known as the democratic movement. That term was just as common as dissident movement. So on a lexical level, there seems to be a lot of borrowing going on by Gorbachev. Gorbachev, in his memoirs, writes that true reform of the Soviet system could only come from within the Communist Party. It is a profound statement and also a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. Because what it means in practice is that communist leaders like Gorbachev could never, ever acknowledge any influence by the dissidents, because that would appear to accept that influences from outside the party were somehow legitimate. So there's this kind of unspoken rule, even with as forward-thinking a person as Gorbachev, an unspoken rule that you cannot acknowledge influences outside of the party. So in a way, we won't ever really know how much of Gorbachev's agenda came either from reading dissident texts or just from a sense of shame that the dissidents were showing over and over again that the Soviet Union was not a law-abiding society. There was something really humiliating about the idea of an allegedly modern country not even being able to operate under its own legal system, and of constantly bending the law. I'm talking about the government constantly bending the laws, breaking the laws, ignoring the laws. So I do think the dissidents deserve a significant amount of indirect credit for the approach that Gorbachev took. At the same time, I have to acknowledge that the centerpiece of Gorbachev's agenda was economic reform. He wanted to revitalize socialism and make it competitive with the capitalist world. Gorbachev was a Leninist. He believed in reviving the ideals of the original Bolshevik revolution, or what he understood to be those ideals. The dissidents were not interested in economic matters. They did not see any kind of inexorable connection between private property and liberty. They really operated in the world of ideas and laws. And so to that extent, there are huge elements of Gorbachev's reform agenda, which you may remember as perestroika, that have nothing to do with the movement and are really all about revitalizing socialism as a set of economic relations.
Interesting. Well, a very good, we talk about this as a story of paradox with paradox and irony. So there is the crowning paradox and irony is that in some senses, the dissidents do get they do get to live to see these reforms, but that's not necessarily the reforms that they thought they were pushing for.
Yes.
Ben, we are unfortunately out of time. The hour has flown by. It's been so terrific to talk about your book. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that there are still questions out there. Please, many of them are answered, if not all of them are answered by picking up a copy of To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, which is indeed available in bookstores. When, Ben? Is it available right now?
Oh yeah, it's out.
Right, it's out right now. So go get yourselves a copy. Like I said, lift with your legs. But you will find it to be a very worthwhile experience. Ben Nathans, thanks so much for joining us on People, Politics, and Prose.
Ron, thank you. As always, it's a pleasure to talk with you.
And it's just terrific. And thanks to all of you for listening in. If you enjoyed our conversation today, please bring a friend, tell a friend, and bring a friend next time, because we always keep going like this at FPRI. To keep up on future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other events at FPRI, please look at our website, fpri.org. Follow us on Facebook. Like us on what used to be called Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Graneri. FPRI thanks its sponsors and partners for their generous support for programs like this. And if you want to see more programs like this, we encourage you to consider becoming a sponsor or partner of FPRI. But until you do that, or after you do that, please just come see us again at the next episode of People, Politics, and Prose. And so until next time, with thanks to everybody at FPRI who makes this possible, I'm Ron Graneri. Thanks for joining us.